Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is a $200 sword from Yeskatana, and before you hear me say anything else, you should know some caveats. One, this is sent to me for free for the purposes of review. Also, I do study Japanese-style swordsmanship, but I'm not an authority figure at it. And also, I am somewhat injured while I was using this sword. I have a bit of a case of tennis elbow that seems to not go away, so do know that I'm not only an expert, but I'm using this in a slightly diminished condition. I also use the sword almost backwards in the case of my review. Usually I practice with it, and then I eventually cut with it, and then I eventually push it into abuse. Here I started with abuse and kind of gradually worked my way backwards before training with it. So I've trained with it and done all that, but worth noting that I diminished the sword before I trained and did EI with it. So worth calling that out because it's not entirely fair to the sword to, go through it fundamentally a different way. I did here. I still feel like I can give you my thoughts on it, but do know that that was the case in the way that I use this sword. Anyway, I'm going to start with the kasha, the end cap here, work my way down, soup to nuts, top to bottom, talk about cutting, using, all that kind of stuff, and then hopefully it gives you an idea if it's worth your $200 or not. The fittings, worth calling out that they're relatively simple. I'll just say this one time. I'd rather honestly have very simple looking fittings, but in $200 swords you can get nicer or more elaborate looking fittings than are on here. Personally, I would rather have very simple with at least some shape and dimension without all the gaudy paint and textures and stuff like that, because in lower price swords, the casting quality tends to be muddy, and the more of it I see, the more elaborate things that try to be attempted, the worse the attempt tends to be. So I like these simple fittings and swords that are budget conscious, and so I have no issue with them. But they are relatively simple alloy fittings, nothing in particular. And the kasha, the end cap right here, transition-wise is overall pretty good, and from a casting quality perspective, I can see they tried to sand off a casting seam here, and we're a little bit more aggressive with it, so there's an imperfection there. But the paint and patina have held up to the abuse, and the time that I've used the sword, it's overall done the job pretty well. As I move down the handle, worth calling out, I like the shape of the handle. I like the overall look of the blue silk and how it meshes with the saya, but it's unacceptably loose ito. And so if I have one major complaint with this sword, it's going to be that this ito is really loose. Now, credit where credit's due. I've abused the sword, I've practiced with it for a while, and the ito's still on. The kasha is still here, it hasn't come undone, so I have to give credit there. But I would say that it's kind of loosest in the middle and towards the top. Towards the end it actually gets a little tighter, and I can actually make out where the panel lines are from the Saki-haba panels down here, because this is where it's tightest. Now it's made the sword hold together, but at the same time I would still say it's unacceptably loose. And I can deform the diamonds, I can move them around, and the more I handle the sword, the more the kind of kittywampus the handle starts to look. It is unacceptably loose, and it gives me a little less confidence in holding the weapon and feeling like I have control over it, because it does feel like some of that is just squirrely under my hand. Naturally, the diamonds have begun to wander as a result. I do see real Samigawa skin though, very small nodule, but it's there. And I don't necessarily make out where the panels are until we go down to the tighter ito here. No hishigami was used either, but I like the shape, but the ito I believe needs to be tighter. Casting quality on the Manuki is meh. The most was attempted there, and the casting quality isn't great. But again, this is a very budget conscious sword, so I'm not expecting much. The Fuchi, again, I can make out a little bit of a heavy hand trying to grind off the seams, but at least they tried to grind off the seams, and no transitions are really present, no hot spots either. As I move up to the tsuba, which has got this wheel tsuba, it looks like it could be a cheese grater on your hands. Fortunately, there's no sharp ledges. From a practical standpoint, it feels actually pretty good in the hand, and aesthetically, I like the way it looks. Overall, it's a perfectly fine tsuba. Simple water jet cutout, doesn't have a lot of dimension, but again, swords in this price point rarely do. If I move down to the saya, I think this is a really bold, pretty looking saya. I like the blue and the gold kind of swishes on it. I think thematically it helps blend the seppa in and other little gold adornments like the shiridome. These weren't attached though. I like it when the shiridome are attached, otherwise they come undone, they whack around and scratch the saya and stuff. So I like them either to not be there or to be glued in. The Sageo for a $200 sword actually was pretty nice. It has a relatively thick and pleasant looking Sageo. It's not like a shoestring, so it's got that going for it too. And from a functional standpoint, the saya didn't rattle, I should say, still doesn't. It is a little raspy though, so you can probably hear it's got a little bit of bind in the saya where it kind of grabs the blade a little bit down there. It's a little tighter than it should be. Helps it not rattle, but at the same time makes it raspy when you're trying to do EI with it. You can kind of hear it coming in and out, and you can't really do much to stop it from making that scruffy sound. Also, it's not aligned quite well, so if I drop the sword in, it kind of bangs on the sidewall of the habaki here. It bangs a little bit, and you can kind of, if you're gingerly with it and kind of keep it in alignment, you don't notice it, but it is a thing to work around while you're doing EI. Other pro though, it doesn't come out when you turn it upside down, but it's not tensioned so that it requires too much to draw, so drawing wise, it's overall pretty nice. The blade, the pointy stabby part, what people are maybe most interested in. I'll start down here at the habaki, very simple brass habaki and kind of the cheapest seppa with, you know, they don't have the more elaborate tooth pattern. It's perfectly fine though, the habaki's serviceable, but like I said, it did bang on the scabbard a little bit. Polish on the blade, if I focus on things I like, the polish is really easy to see in just about any light. It has extra zazz, a little extra etch on it. I happen to think it was a very handsome sword. When you pull it out, if you're just gonna look at it, there's some character on the hamon. It's very easy to see. I think they did a good job etching it. But there were a lot of extra tool marks in the bohi, and the kisaki is basically just wire brush the other direction. So the polish isn't very elaborate. For $200, you don't necessarily expect a lot, but the Ronin RK series is under $200. The polish is cleaner than this. The inexpensive Huawei swords, they're a little bit more expensive than this, but they also have nicer and cleaner polishes. So the termination of the bohi, you know, the tool markings in it are you know, a little bit below average in terms of what you can get, or I should maybe say it's average for what you can get for $200, but there are folks that I think do a little bit better job with it. Now, in terms of cutting, I would basically just say that the sword cut, it was serviceably sharp. It could certainly be sharper. It didn't really cut water, but it didn't do any kind of amazing job, but it was serviceably sharp. It had a nice edge on it right out of the box, and I was able to do most of the things that you would hope to be able to do with a sword in terms of cutting water bottles, pool noodles, and that kind of stuff. It didn't bite into the pool noodles as well as I'd hoped, but I got a few good cuts on it, and water bottles, it did the job just fine. One of the first things I cut though was a shaving cream can. It was really fun, and it basically rolled the edge a little bit. So a shaving cream can is a steel can, and ideally it doesn't do anything to the edge, but it rolled this one, which tells me that it's probably a little bit soft, because if the hardened edge is rolling instead of chipping, then it's probably a little bit on the softer side, and that's kind of substantiated by some of the experience I had in cutting you know, various bits of wood around. I cut some branches, I cut some logs, I whacked it into a tree, and the blade would take a set actually pretty easy. It would bend pretty easily, and the more it bent, the easier it bent, and so I think the sword is maybe just a little bit on the soft side. I don't know if making it simply harder is the solution to that, if it needs to be tempered differently, but in practice, it took edge roll in areas where I would hope it wouldn't, and the blade also bent quite a bit. Now, it didn't fail in doing any of the abusive things. All of the kind of damage that I saw is really to be expected. Something diminished, some scratching, some rolling, some chipping, some bending. All of those are expected when I'm doing the abusive kind of stuff that I did here. But I would say that to a lesser degree would be ideal, and this strikes me as maybe being a little bit on the soft side. Not so much that I would say it's a deal breaker or bad or worthless, or you know that it's really problematic or something that needs to be addressed given the cost. But the Ronin RK swords held up better. They're also differentially hardened, a little less expensive. So as I think about competition, very similar construction to a sword, and I think they held up just a little bit better. All right, sword friends, that's really all the information I can give you. Hopefully, it's enough for you to make up your own mind on the subject. Now, for me personally, do I recommend it for $200? No. And the main reason, realistically, is the Ito. There's other little nitpicks that I could say, you know, like the polish and the bohi and some of the tool marks and, you know, this, that, and the other. But overall, I think it's a handsome looking sword, and nothing apart from really the Ito really strikes me as something that I'm really concerned about. Now, if you decide to get one anyway, because it is a handsome sword, and if you want to get one because you like the style of it, can't blame you. It's pretty. I'd recommend taking some lacquer. Go to a local hardware store, get a can of lacquer, spray it on, douse it nice and heavy, and that'll keep the diamonds in position. It's a relatively inexpensive way to kind of lock things down a little bit. At the same time, I don't think you should have to do that, and if you do, then it tends to be a little bit more abrasive to your hands. It tends to feel a little harder on the hands. Anyway, apart from that, it did all the things fine, but it didn't do anything better than some of the other swords, like the Ronin RK. I've compared it to a number of times throughout the review. It didn't do anything better than that sword. Arguably, it did some things worse. So I don't think it necessarily represents a great value proposition. At the same time, it's a fine looking sword. I like it. It held up. It did most of the things well, except really for the Ito. And so on a budget, that would be the main part where I would say it needs to be addressed before I could give it a recommendation. Anyway, that's all I've got. Hopefully it's been helpful. Special thanks to Yeskatana for sending this my way. I do have another Tachi style sword to review from Yeskatana, so stick around and eventually I will have that review out. If there's anything else you'd like to see about this sword, questions you have, throw them in the commentary down below. I will link Yeskatana's website as well as measurements and all that kind of stuff down there. That's all I got though. Cheers and thanks for watching.